My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 42 years old, and if you'd asked me a year ago what the most valuable thing on my 12-acre ranch was, I probably would have pointed toward my cattle, maybe the tractor if it was running that week. But I would have been wrong. The most valuable thing I owned was an old cedar fence that most people would have called ugly. The folks living behind it certainly did. Funny thing is, after they tore that fence down without asking, they ended up spending 4 days wondering how 72 luxury homes could suddenly run out of water. And that's the part nobody in Cedar Ridge Preserve likes to talk about anymore. I grew up outside Mason Creek, Texas, where the dirt stains your boots red and your neighbors wave even when they don't know your name. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, bought our ranch after coming home from Korea. He never had much money, but he had hands that could build almost anything. Every winter he'd split cedar logs by hand, shave them smooth with an old draw knife, then fit them together one board at a time. The fence that separated our ranch from what would eventually become Cedar Ridge Preserve wasn't just another property line. Grandpa started building it in 1954 when my dad was still a little boy, following him around with a hammer that was too heavy to lift. I grew up hearing stories about every section. That post came from the cedar tree your grandmother planted. That corner survived the tornado of '68. Don't ever replace good wood just because somebody wants something prettier. Those weren't just stories. They were family history nailed together one board at a time. After Grandpa passed away, I promised myself I'd never tear that fence down unless it physically collapsed. Sure, it leaned a little in places. The cedar had turned silver from decades of Texas sun, but it was solid, legal, honest, everything my grandfather believed people ought to be. Then Cedar Ridge Preserve showed up. 72 enormous homes where there had once been open pasture, stone entrances, decorative fountains, white concrete sidewalks, electric gates that probably cost more than my first house. Most of the families weren't bad people. Busy professionals, doctors, tech executives, folks who wanted quiet weekends in the country without actually living like country people. The problem wasn't most of the homeowners. The problem was the HOA president, Vanessa Holloway. Vanessa was the kind of woman who walked into every conversation already convinced she'd won it. Perfect white blazer, oversized sunglasses even when it was cloudy, clipboard tucked under one arm like it was some badge of authority. She smiled the way lawyers smile before asking questions they already know the answer to. We crossed paths several times over the years. At first it was friendly enough. Then the letters started showing up. Your fence lowers neighborhood property values. Your cattle are visible from the walking trail. Your equipment storage is aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. I remember laughing the first time I read one because community standards stopped exactly where my property began. I even called the number on the letter once. Vanessa answered herself. "Mr. Mercer," she said pleasantly, "we'd simply like to improve the appearance along our shared boundary." Shared? I laughed. You mean my fence? It's visible from our neighborhood. So are clouds. Doesn't mean you own those either. She didn't appreciate that joke. Over the next year, the letters kept coming. Suggestions became requests. Requests slowly became demands disguised as recommendations. A landscaping committee even knocked on my front door offering to replace my cedar fence with black ornamental steel at no cost to me. I thanked them for the offer and said no. One elderly gentleman actually understood. He looked at the old cedar and quietly said, "My father built fences like this." Then Vanessa interrupted him before he could finish. "Historic charm doesn't excuse deterioration," she said. I remember looking her straight in the eye. "That fence has been standing longer than your neighborhood has existed. It'll probably outlive both of us." She turned around without another word. Looking back now, that was probably the moment she decided this had become personal. 3 weeks later, I drove 2 counties over to inspect an easement survey for a client. It took longer than expected because an old boundary marker had been buried under 20 years of brush. By the time I got home, the sun was dropping low enough to turn the fields orange. I noticed something was wrong before I even reached my driveway. The horizon looked open, too open. At first, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. Then my stomach dropped. 350 feet of cedar fencing. Gone. Every single board. Every post cut perfectly flush with the ground. Standing where my grandfather's fence had been was a brand new black steel fence with security cameras already mounted on the posts. It looked expensive, modern, and according to my surveyor's eye, it sat almost 2 feet inside my property. I climbed out of my truck without shutting the engine off. My boots crunched across fresh sawdust scattered over the red dirt. Somebody had worked fast. They'd even hauled away every piece of the original cedar like it had never existed. Then I spotted an envelope tucked beneath a decorative stone beside the new fence. Heavy cream paper. Gold embossed logo. Cedar Ridge Preserve Homeowners Association. I opened it slowly, already knowing I wasn't going to like what I read. As part of our ongoing neighborhood enhancement initiative, the association has completed a complimentary perimeter improvement to maintain consistent community aesthetics. We appreciate your cooperation. They called destroying 70 years of my family's history. Complimentary. I folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, looked down at the fresh tire tracks cutting across my pasture, and instead of getting angry, I got quiet. Because when you're a licensed easement surveyor, sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do isn't yell. It's go looking for old paperwork. I didn't drive to the sheriff's office. I didn't march over to Cedar Ridge Preserve looking for Vanessa. I didn't even call my attorney. At least not yet. Instead, I walked into my workshop, brushed the dust off an old metal filing cabinet that had belonged to my father, and started opening drawers. Most people think land disputes are won with loud voices. They aren't. They're won by whoever kept the paperwork when everybody else threw theirs away. My grandfather never threw anything away. Every survey, every easement agreement, every county map, every handwritten note from survey crews going back decades sat inside neatly labeled folders that smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. About 20 minutes later, I found exactly what I was looking for. A county easement package dated August 1976. I remembered seeing it years earlier when Dad explained why nobody was ever allowed to dig near the North Alfalfa field. At the time, I was just a teenager more interested in baseball than property law. Now every page suddenly mattered. The original developer who owned the land before Cedar Ridge Preserve existed had negotiated a permanent water easement across our ranch because running the pipeline around our property would have cost too much. The county approved it under one condition. The landowner retained the right to suspend access if the easement corridor was materially obstructed, altered, or if adjacent property improvements violated surveyed boundaries in a way that interfered with maintenance or ownership rights. I read that paragraph 3 times before leaning back in my chair. Then I smiled, not because I was happy, but because I finally understood why Grandpa always refused to sell that strip of land, no matter how many offers came in over the years. He hadn't been protecting a fence. He'd been protecting leverage. Early the next morning, I drove out to the county records office, where an old survey technician named Carl Benson still worked. Carl had known my father for 30 years. He looked over his reading glasses when I walked in carrying the rolled survey maps. "Morning, Ethan. You look like somebody stole your dog." "Not my dog," I answered. "My fence." He frowned. "That old cedar one?" "Every board." 10 minutes later, we were standing over the county's original plats. Carl measured the coordinates twice before shaking his head. "They're inside your property, all right, by 21 inches. "Close enough?" I asked. He snorted. "Close only counts in horseshoes and bad surveying." We both laughed, but only for a second. Then he grew serious again. "You know what runs under there?" I nodded. "I do now." Carl leaned closer. "If they're sitting permanent structures inside the easement maintenance zone without authorization, public utilities will have to inspect before anyone touches that pipeline." Exactly what I was thinking. "You're not planning anything stupid, are you?" "No," I said honestly. "I'm planning something legal." He smiled the way old Texans smile when they know exactly what you're about to do without needing another explanation. Before leaving, I filed an official encroachment complaint along with updated survey documentation. By lunchtime, county engineers had already scheduled an emergency inspection because unauthorized construction above critical utility infrastructure automatically triggered safety procedures. That afternoon, I parked my backhoe beside the north field. My neighbor Hank rolled his pickup onto the dirt road and climbed out scratching his gray beard. "Heard something happened with your fence." "Sure did." "You gonna tear that shiny thing down?" "Nope." "Sue 'em?" "Maybe later." He looked at the backhoe. "Then what are you doing?" I pointed toward the utility markers, making sure the county can inspect what they're legally required to inspect. Hank stared at me for a few seconds before breaking into the slowest grin I'd seen in years. "Lord have mercy. You're about to teach somebody the difference between owning a subdivision and understanding Texas property law." I laughed. "Something like that." We dug carefully, nowhere near the pipe itself, exposing only enough surrounding soil for county inspectors to access the maintenance corridor safely. By 4 o'clock, 2 county utility trucks rolled in. Their supervisor walked the site with my survey documents, measured the fence location himself, then sighed. "Well, this is unfortunate. For who?" I asked. He looked toward the luxury homes beyond the trees. "Depends where you live." Safety regulations required them to temporarily shut down the pumping station feeding Cedar Ridge Preserve until inspectors verified that the newly installed fence hadn't compromised maintenance access or damaged the easement. Nobody argued. Nobody arrested anybody. Nobody accused me of sabotage because I hadn't touched the water line. I hadn't even touched their fence. I had simply reported an illegal encroachment. The county did exactly what county procedures required. By sunset, the neighborhood's irrigation system stopped humming. The next morning, I drove into town for cattle feed and passed the subdivision entrance. Sprinklers that usually sprayed immaculate green lawns sat silent. Landscaping crews stood around scratching their heads while expensive flower beds baked beneath the Texas sun. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. "Mr. Mercer, speaking. This is Melissa with Cedar Ridge Property Management. We're experiencing a temporary water interruption and wondered if you might know anything about nearby construction." "Construction?" I replied. "You mean the construction where somebody built a fence on my land?" Silence. "I'll have someone call you back." They never did. Day 2 felt different. Water storage tanks were running low. Homeowners started posting in neighborhood Facebook groups asking whether anyone else had weak pressure. Someone blamed drought restrictions. Another blamed the county. One resident uploaded a picture of brown grass with the caption, "We pay $1,200 a year in HOA dues for this." I couldn't help smiling. By afternoon, I could actually smell stagnant pool water drifting across the pasture every time the wind shifted. Algae doesn't waste time under a Texas summer sun. Hank stopped by again carrying 2 cold sodas. We sat on the tailgate watching birds circle above the fields. "Feel bad for the regular folks?" he asked. I nodded immediately. "Some of them, yeah. Most didn't ask for this." "Then why not fix it?" I looked toward the subdivision. "Because if I give in now, Vanessa learned she can erase 70 years of family history with a construction crew and a letterhead." Hank cracked open his soda. "Fair point." Later that evening, an elderly couple from the subdivision surprised me by driving up my gravel road. The husband introduced himself as Harold. "I don't know exactly what's happening," he admitted, "but I heard about the fence." His wife stepped forward holding an old photograph. "We took this during a neighborhood picnic years ago. It showed my grandfather's cedar fence stretching behind a group of children chasing each other through wildflowers." "I always thought it was beautiful," she said quietly. "I'm sorry." That apology hit harder than I expected. They hadn't come to argue. They simply recognized that something irreplaceable had been taken. I thanked them. And after they left, I tucked the photograph into my truck visor. It reminded me this wasn't homeowners versus farmers. It was arrogance versus respect. By the morning of day 3, the situation inside Cedar Ridge Preserve had turned into controlled chaos. Water trucks lined up outside the entrance. Landscapers couldn't work. Pools had turned cloudy. Pressure had dropped low enough that some upstairs showers barely trickled. Social media filled with complaints, rumors, and accusations. Then, just after lunch, I heard the unmistakable sound of a white luxury SUV crunching down my gravel driveway much faster than anybody should have been driving. It stopped hard enough to throw dust over my mailbox. Vanessa Holloway climbed out wearing immaculate white slacks that immediately sank into the red Texas clay she usually avoided. She carried a leather folder under one arm and her phone in the other hand, like she intended to record every second of whatever happened next. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She marched straight toward me with the confidence of someone who had spent her entire life believing other people eventually folded under pressure. She stopped a few feet away and said, "Mr. Mercer, we need to talk." I brushed the dirt off my gloves, looked past her toward the brand-new steel fence standing exactly where it never should have been, then answered as calmly as I could. "No, Vanessa. I think for the first time, you're finally ready to listen." Vanessa crossed her arms before I could say another word, looked around my ranch like she was inspecting a construction site instead of somebody's home, then said, "You've made your point. Our residents need their water back." I reached into the cab of my truck, pulled out a weathered folder, and handed it to her without saying anything. She opened it, expecting another complaint letter. Instead, the first page was the certified survey showing her brand new fence sitting 21 inches inside my property. The second page was the county inspection report confirming the encroachment. The third was a copy of the easement agreement with one paragraph highlighted in yellow. I watched her confidence fade line by line. She looked up and forced a smile. This doesn't mean you can hold an entire neighborhood hostage. I'm not holding anybody hostage, I replied. Your board built permanent improvements where they didn't belong. The county suspended water service because they couldn't legally maintain critical infrastructure. That's not my decision. That's theirs. She tried another approach. Surely we can be reasonable. I couldn't help laughing, not because it was funny, but because of how quickly the conversation had changed. Reasonable? 3 days ago, your contractors cut down a fence my grandfather built with his own hands. Nobody asked permission. Nobody knocked on my door. You left me a letter calling it a complimentary improvement. Her jaw tightened. It was an enhancement for everyone's benefit. Everyone? I asked quietly. My grandfather spent months building that fence. My father repaired it after storms. I learned to drive a tractor riding beside that fence. Tell me, whose benefit was it when your crew hauled every board away like 70 years of family history was yard waste? For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't have an answer. Instead, one of the attorneys who had driven separately stepped forward. He introduced himself, asked if we could sit down, and within 5 minutes it became painfully obvious he understood the situation far better than Vanessa did. He flipped through every document twice before slowly removing his glasses. Mrs. Holloway, he said carefully, did the board obtain a boundary verification before approving the installation? She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. We relied on the contractor, he sighed. That wasn't the question. Silence settled over the pasture. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment. Finally, I slid one more document across the tailgate. It wasn't a lawsuit. Not yet. It was an itemized demand. 350 feet of handcrafted cedar fencing built using reclaimed timber of documented historical value, professional removal and reconstruction, survey costs, legal consultation, easement restoration expenses. Total compensation came to just over $91,000. Underneath that was a second document, a revised 10-year easement agreement requiring written approval before any landscaping, fencing, excavation, or construction within 50 feet of the pipeline corridor, along with quarterly inspection rights to ensure future access remained unobstructed. Vanessa stared at the number, then looked back at me as if I'd lost my mind. You're serious? Completely. $91,000? Actually, I said, pointing toward the bottom of the page. That's the inexpensive option. The attorney kept reading until he reached the final paragraph. His face changed immediately. Vanessa. She looked at him. If this easement is revoked, he continued quietly, engineering estimates for relocating the primary water line are well over $1 million before permits, environmental review, and road reconstruction. Nobody spoke after that. They didn't need to. The math spoke for itself. Late the next afternoon, I received a call asking if I would attend an emergency board meeting. I declined. If they wanted to negotiate, they could do it on my property where this whole mess had started. On the fourth morning, 3 vehicles pulled into my driveway. The attorney climbed out first. Vanessa followed, looking exhausted in a way expensive clothes couldn't hide. She held a cashier's check instead of a clipboard this time. Funny how quickly authority changes hands when reality finally catches up. She handed me the check without making eye contact. Then she signed every page of the revised easement agreement. No speeches, no excuses, just signatures. Before leaving, she stopped beside the empty stretch where my grandfather's fence had once stood. I honestly thought we were improving the neighborhood, she said quietly. I believed she meant it. That was the strange part. Not every bad decision comes from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from people becoming so convinced they're right that they stop asking who they're hurting. Maybe you were, I answered. Just not my side of it. Over the next 2 weeks, local craftsmen helped me rebuild the fence, almost exactly the way Grandpa had taught Dad. Cedar again, and finished. Strong enough to outlast another generation. The only difference was that this time I set every post 6 inches farther inside my surveyed line. Not because the law required it, but because I never wanted another person pretending they didn't know where my property ended. A month later, Cedar Ridge Preserve elected a new HOA president. One of the first things the new board did was apologize publicly to every resident for the unnecessary legal costs the previous leadership had created. They also adopted a rule requiring independent surveys before approving any boundary-related projects. As for Vanessa, I heard she quietly sold her house before the end of the year. Maybe she wanted a fresh start. Maybe she was simply tired of being reminded that confidence isn't the same thing as competence. Every now and then, I'll see families walking along the trail behind my ranch, Kids still stop to look through the cedar rails at the cattle, and their parents usually wave. I always wave back. None of this was ever about punishing an entire neighborhood. It was about reminding one person that respect doesn't begin at the property line. It begins the moment you recognize that someone else's history matters just as much as your own plans. And every time I run my hand across those cedar boards, I still think about my grandfather smiling somewhere, probably saying exactly what he always used to say. Good fences don't make good neighbors, but honest neighbors never need to test a good fence in the first place. So now I'm curious. If someone tore down something your family had built generations ago because they thought it looked better their way, would you have handled it differently? Or do you think I went too far? Let me know in the comments because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'd genuinely like to hear where you stand.